Welcome to Forgotten Urban Histories. This episode was supposed to be about the island of Polevia. However, a very special friend of my family requested that I change the focus and record episode 6 first. And so I dedicate this episode to Kim and Damien and present to you The Dome That Held Its Breath. Every city has a skyline, and every skyline has a story told in bricks, steel, and stone. Usually, on Forgotten Urban Histories, we trace the architectural skeletons of abandoned neighbourhoods, explore the forgotten logic of ancient street grids, or exhume the ghosts of cities buried right beneath our feet. But today, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of looking at how an urban landscape slowly faded away over centuries, we are zooming in on a single, heart-stopping microsecond where architecture and human survival collided. We are travelling to the tiny, sun-bleached island of Malta in the spring of 1942, a time when the island was earning the grim title of the most heavily bombed place on Earth. In this episode, we step into the Rotunda of Mosta, an engineering marvel boasting the third largest unsupported church dome in the world. On April 9th, 1942, as 300 citizens huddled inside to escape a relentless Axis air raid, a half-ton German bomb tore straight through the stone sky of the ceiling. What happened next is a masterclass in urban suspense, a ballistics mystery that defies simple physics and a testament on how a community's grandest monument became its ultimate shield. Pull up a chair, because today we aren't just exploring a city's history, we're listening to the moment it held its breath. If you stand in the centre of the Mediterranean Sea and look at a map, the island of Malta looks like a mere speck of dust dropped between Sicily and North Africa. It is tiny, just 17 miles long. But in the spring of 1942, this tiny fragment of golden limestone was the most heavily bombed place on the face of the earth. For months, the sky above Malta did not belong to the birds or the clouds. It belonged to the Luftwaffe. Between the thump of British anti-aircraft artillery and the terrifying screaming dive of the German Junker bombers, the people of Malta lived in a state of perpetual, vibrating, noisy fear. The sound of war had become the city's new architecture. However, if you travelled just a few miles inland, away from the burning docks of the Grand Harbour, you would find the town of Mosta. And, in the centre of Mosta, rising out of the dusty, narrow streets like a limestone mountain, stood a structure that defied the very gravity of wartime despair. The Rotunda of Mosta, the third largest unsupported church dome in the world. To look up at it from the street was to look up at an impossibility. A colossal crown of stone, nearly 40 metres wide, suspended over the heads of the populace without a single pillar, a single steel beam, or a single column to hold it up. It was a monument of pure faith, pure physics, and, as the citizens of Mosta would soon come to believe, pure miracle. But to understand how this dome became a shield on the afternoon of April 9th, 1942, we first have to understand how an obscure, untrained local architect built a Roman pantheon in the middle of a Maltese village, and how he did it by pulling off one of the greatest spatial illusions in urban history. Go back to the 1830s. Mosta was a quiet, deeply religious agricultural town. Their existing parish church was tiny, cramped, entirely inadequate for a growing population. They needed something bigger. But they didn't have the funds of the Vatican, nor did they have the access to the elite engineering minds of Paris or London. What they had was a local resident named Giorgio Gronet de Vassi. Gronet was an eccentric man. He wasn't a certified architect. He was a citizen who had studied in Rome and become utterly obsessed with the ancient Roman pantheon. He looked at his small devout hometown and declared that Mosta deserved nothing less than a giant neoclassic replica of Rome's ancient wonder. The Catholic Church authorities were sceptical. The local government thought he was insane. How could a community of farmers and stonemasons build a self-supporting dome of that magnitude? The maths didn't seem to add up, and the risk of a catastrophic collapse during construction was immense. But Gronert had a plan that was as brilliant logistically as it was architecturally. He knew the town couldn't stop practicing their faith while a new church was being built. They couldn't just tear the old church down. So, Gronert designed the giant rotunda to be built around the old church. Imagine the psychological surrealism of that urban construction site. For nearly 30 years, the people of Mosta walked into their familiar, cramped medieval church to attend Sunday Mass. But as they sat in the pews, they could look through the windows and see massive golden limestone walls slowly rising up outside, encircling them like a giant tide. Year after year, the outer ring grew higher, sealing the old church inside a giant stone cylinder. When it came to build the dome itself, Gronert eschewed the standard European practice of using massive, expensive wooden scaffolding to support the ceiling as it was built. Instead, the local masons used a traditional Maltese technique. They built the dome in concentric, self-locking rings of stone. Each layer of limestone blocks was slightly angled inward, locking against the previous layer. Each ring acted as a vice, holding itself up through sheer compression. Finally, in 1860, the giant dome was capped with its lantern. The outer shell was complete, and then came the grand reveal. Workers went inside the structure and piece by piece, stone by stone, dismantled the old church from the inside out, carrying the debris through the front doors of the newly born giant. When the dust cleared, the citizens of Mosta stood inside a breathtaking cavernous void. The acoustics were hypnotic. A whisper on one side of the circular hall could be heard clearly on exactly the opposite side, carrying seamlessly along the curved white and blue painted walls. It was a space designed for holy echoes, for hymns, for the low collective murmur of a community in prayer. It was an architectural marvel designed for peace. But 80 years later, that very acoustic perfection would become a trap. By 1942, Malta was no longer just an island of farmers. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the British Empire, positioned directly at the throat of the Mediterranean supply lines. Because of this, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini wanted Malta wiped off the map. The bombing of Malta was not a matter of selective military strikes. It was an exercise in total urban erasure. Over a 2-year period, more than 14,000 tons of bombs were dropped on this tiny archipelago. The air raid sirens became the dominant soundscape of daily life, wailing up to 17 times a day. In the cities surrounding the harbours, the urban fabric fractured. Streets turned into canyons of white rubble. The population learned to adapt, shifting their entire existence underground into deep tunnels carved into the bedrock. But the human spirit can only spend so many consecutive weeks in the dark, breathing in damp limestone dust by the light of a single candle. People needed to breathe. They needed to see the sky. And in a deeply Catholic society like Malta, they needed to look up at something higher than the roof of a bunker. Which brings us to April 9th, 1942. It is a Thursday afternoon. The heat of the Mediterranean sun is just beginning to soften as evening approaches. Inside the Rotunda of Mosta, the air is cool, insulated by walls that are several feet thick. The giant dome overhead, painted in a meticulous diamond pattern of white, blue and gold, feels like a private sky. Around 4:30 p.m, the church doors are open and people are trickling in. It is just days before the feast of St. Publius, and roughly 300 parishioners have gathered for evening mass. They are sitting in the wooden pews, surrounded by the familiar scent of burning incense and old wax. The priest is preparing the altar. The acoustics of the dome amplify the quiet rustle of clothing, the coughing of children, the murmuring of rosaries. And then the sirens begin to wail. Outside, the sky over Mosta is filled with the black puffs of flak. A squadron of German Junker 88 bombers has crossed the coast, carrying a payload of high-explosive ordnance meant to paralyse the island's interior. Inside the church, the 300 people do not run. The nearest underground shelters are too far, and besides, the Rotunda is their fortress. They believe the massive stone dome overhead is impenetrable, and their faith is a shield. They stay in their pews, bowing their heads, their prayers growing louder to drown out the roar in the sky. They do not know that at that exact moment, thousands of feet above the lantern of the church, a 500-kilogram high-explosive bomb has just detached from the belly of a German aircraft, and it is falling at terminal velocity, aimed directly at the centre of the dome. To understand why 300 people stayed in their pews as a half-ton bomb hurtled towards them, you have to understand what it meant to live in Malta in 1942. You have to understand how the war completely inverted the concept of the city. In normal times, urban design is about reaching upwards. We build facades, towers, monuments, and balconies to catch the light and command the horizon. But under the weight of the Blitz, survival meant abandoning the surface entirely. The urban landscape of Malta did not expand outward or upward, it dug down. Malta is built on a massive foundation of limestone. It is a soft, golden rock, easily quarried, but remarkably durable. For centuries, the Maltese had used this stone to build their fortress cities above ground. But in 1940, as the first Italian bombers appeared on the horizon, people realised that their salvation lay not in what they could build with the stone, but what they could carve out of it. Almost overnight, a frantic subterranean gold rush began. The government hired thousands of miners, stonemasons, and everyday civilians to excavate a shallow civilization beneath the streets. If you were to walk through the cities of Valletta, Floriana, or the three cities during the height of the siege, you would find the surface streets eerily abandoned. Shattered glass, burning timber, and mountains of white plaster dust. But beneath your feet, a parallel world was thriving. Hundreds of feet down, carved directly into the bedrock, were miles of narrow, hand-hewn tunnels. These weren't temporary shelters, they were underground cities. In Valletta alone, the ancient railway tunnels and old night-era countermines were converted into vast public dormitories. The conditions were brutal. The air was thick and humid and constantly choked with the smell of kerosene lanterns, sweat, and unwashed linen. Because the limestone absorbed moisture, the walls literally wept. Water dripped constantly from the ceilings, turning floors into slick, muddy slides. Disease, particularly scabies and typhoid, ran rampant through the dark corridors. Families would claim a tiny 6-foot-wide section of a tunnel wall, separating themselves from their neighbours with nothing more than a hanging bedsheet. They brought down their most prized possessions, a wooden chair, a crucifix, or a mattress wrapped in burlap. In these damp subterranean trenches, children were born, old people died, and thousands of citizens spent up to 20 hours a day waiting. So imagine the psychological toll of that existence. Every time a bomb struck the surface, the limestone bedrock of the island would shudder. In the tunnels, the lights would flicker out. Dust would rain down from the raw ceiling, blinding the occupants in total darkness. People would hold their breath, waiting for the cave-in, listening to the muffled groans of their city being dismantled above them. This underground existence created a profound sense of claustrophobia, a sensory deprivation that warped the human psyche. The Maltese were a people of the sun, of open-air piazzas and vibrant street markets. Now they were cave dwellers, entombed alive by choice. And this is where the town of Mosta differed. Mosta was an inland town, an agricultural hub surrounded by fields. It didn't have the deep, sprawling underground network of the harbour cities. They dug dugouts and small public trenches, but these were shallow, hot, and felt less like a fortress and more like a trap. More importantly, the people of Mosta had an intense territorial pride in their rotunda. They had watched their grandfathers build it, they had sacrificed their own wages to fund it. To abandon the church and crawl into a dark, muddy hole in the ground felt like an act of surrender, not just to the enemy, but to despair itself. So when the air raid sirens began their terrible rising wail at 4:30 p.m. on April 9th, the 300 parishioners inside the Mosta Dome made a conscious, collective choice. They looked up at that magnificent ceiling, at the pristine blue and gold diamonds, at the massive stone blocks locked together in perfect mathematical harmony, and they chose to believe that Gronit's dome was stronger than Hitler's bombs. They chose the light, the space, and the dignity of their sanctuary over the suffocating darkness of the trenches. The priest, Father Don Anton Camilleri stood at the altar. He looked out at his congregation. He saw mothers holding their infants, elderly farmers with weathered hands clutching rosary beads, young men who had spent the morning clearing rubble from the streets. He did not tell them to run. He did not panic. Instead, he raised his hands and continued the liturgy. Outside, the world was ending. The roar of the Junker 88 engines grew so loudly that the glass in the high windows of the dome began to chatter in the lead frames. The anti-aircraft batteries on the edge of town were firing at maximum capacity, filling the air with a rhythmic, concussive bass line. Inside, the congregation began to pray the rosary. 300 voices, amplified by the perfect looping acoustics of the circular hall, rose together to meet the noise of the sky. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. The acoustics of the dome, which had been built to elevate the human voice towards the heavens, now acted as a psychological shield. The collective murmur of the prayer bounced off the limestone walls, wrapping around the parishioners, creating a cocoon of sound that kept the terror of the world at bay. But a mathematical illusion cannot stop kinetic energy. Thousands of feet above them, a German bombardier adjusted his crosshairs. He wasn't looking at people, he was looking at landmarks. To the Luftwaffe pilots, the giant white-domed church of Mosta was the perfect navigational waypoint and an irresistible target. The bomb bay doors opened. The 500-kilogram SC-500 bomb fell free. It was a weapon designed for maximum urban destruction, encased in heavy cast steel packed with a lethal mixture of TNT and amatol. It fell through the bright Mediterranean air, screaming as its tail fins stabilized its descent. It was a straight line of mathematical certainty, tearing down towards the center of the self-supporting dome. 300 people prayed below. The bomb was seconds away, and the stone sky was about to break. Time has a way of stretching right before it breaks. At exactly 4:40 p.m, the ceiling of the Rotunda of Mosta did not just rupture, it exploded inwards. To the 300 people looking up from the pews, it must have looked like the hand of God or the fist of a demon had simply punched through their private stone sky. The 500-kilogram German bomb hit the outer shell of the dome at a slight angle, travelling at hundreds of miles an hour. When half a ton of weaponized iron meets solid limestone, the physics are spectacular and terrifying. The bomb punched a clean circular hole through the thick masonry. The impact sent a shockwave rippling through the concentric rings of the dome. Imagine the visual chaos of that microsecond. The pristine hand-painted patterns of blue, white and gold diamonds. The sky, the parishioners had chosen over the dark bunkers, was instantly obliterated. Millions of tiny stone fragments and plaster dust burst into the air, illuminated by the sudden, blinding shafts of the afternoon light that poured through the newly torn hole in the ceiling. The bomb did not detonate on impact. Instead, it plummeted through the cavernous air of the sanctuary like a falling anvil, and it struck the altar steps first, a glancing blow that shattered the marble. Then, carrying a terrifying amount of kinetic energy, the massive dark grey cylinder skidded across the church floor. It groaned and screeched as it ground against the stone, carving a deep, jagged star across the sanctuary, kicking up sparks and a blinding wall of limestone dust. In the pews, people threw themselves to the floor. Mothers covered their children with their bodies. Men protected their wives and braced for the pressure wave that would flatten the walls and turn the limestone structure into a tomb. Everyone closed their eyes. Everyone waited for the flash of light that would end their world, and then nothing. It is a biological fact that after a massive trauma, the human brain struggles to process silence. The roar of the aeroplane engines was gone. The anti-aircraft guns outside seemed to have faded into another dimension. The frantic prayers had ceased. There was only absolute, heavy, choking silence, wrapped in a thick, blinding cloud of white dust. For a few agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air inside the church tasted like chalk and old mortar. Through the haze, the sunbeams cutting down through the ruined ceilings looked like a column of solid light illuminating a scene of utter surrealism. Slowly, heavily, heads began to rise from the pews. Parishioners looked at themselves, then each other. They patted their chests, their arms, their faces. There was no blood. There were no screams of agony. And then, as the white dust began to settle, the fog cleared to reveal the centre of the church floor. There, resting in the middle of the sanctuary, lay the bomb. It was an ugly, brutal thing, a massive cylinder of dark, scraped metal resting peacefully on the shattered remains of the church floor like a sleeping predator. It was close enough for the people in the front pews to reach out and touch. They could see the stenciled German serial number on its casing. They could smell the hot, acrid stench of scorched iron and burning friction. Then the realization hit the room like a physical blow. The bomb hadn't exploded. Yet. Weapons of this size often carried delayed action fuses. It could detonate in a minute, it could detonate in an hour. The 300 people inside were not survivors. They were hostages to a giant piece of unexploded Nazi ordnance. Panic, which had been frozen by shock, was about to erupt. But before the crowd could stampede for the narrow exit doors, Father Camilleri stepped forward from the dust-covered altar. His vestments were white with limestone powder. He looked at the giant bomb, then he looked at his people. And with a voice that shook but refused to break, he told them to move out, not run, to walk, slowly, quietly. The evacuation of the Rotunda was a masterclass in tense urban survival. People squeezed past the massive iron shell, eyeing it with a mixture of terror and awe. They trickled out into the bright afternoon light of the Mosta streets, blinking against the sun, their hair and clothes entirely white from plaster dust. They looked like ghosts escaping a tomb. Within minutes, the building was empty. The great iron doors were swung shut, sealing the predator inside its stone cage. Outside, the town of Mosta erupted into an uproar. Word spread through the narrow streets like wildfire. The church was hit, but the sky didn't fall. The bomb is resting on the floor and it is silent. But the danger to the city was far from over. A 500-kilogram bomb left alone in an urban centre is a ticking clock that can flatten an entire neighbourhood. The civilian population had done their part. They had survived. Now the fate of Mosta belonged to a tiny, overlooked group of men whose job description was to walk directly towards things designed to kill them. The Royal Engineers Bomb Disposal Unit was on the way, and as they drove through the rubble-strewn streets towards the giant dome, they knew that defusing this weapon would require them to unravel a ballistics mystery that defied explanation to this day. When the Royal Engineers Bomb Disposal Squad stepped into the Rotunda of Mosta, the silence inside was heavy. The white limestone dust was still suspended in the air, drifting through the shafts of sunlight like falling snow. And there, in the centre of the sanctuary, lay the half-ton of German steel, completely motionless. Defusing a bomb of this magnitude in an enclosed stone space is an exercise in extreme psychological control. If the fuse slipped or a single magnetic tremor triggered the detonator, the resulting blast would not just kill the men in the room. The concussive force trapped inside the circular walls of the dome would collapse the entire architectural masterpiece inwards, pulverizing everything into a mass grave. Working in the dim light, the disposal experts knelt over the weapon. With steady hands, they isolated the impact fuse. Minutes felt like hours, but slowly, methodically, the mechanism was unscrewed and lifted away. The heart of the beast had been removed. The bomb was rolled out of the church, loaded onto a flatbed lorry, and driven through cheering crowds of locals to the cliffs of Malta, where its explosive payload was safely dumped into the sea. To the people of Mosta, there was no need for a scientific inquiry. The verdict was instantaneous and unanimous. It was a miracle. The hand of the Madonna had personally caught the bomb and laid it gently on the floor to save her people. In a city that had been battered, starved and terrified for 2 years, this event became a psychological turning point. It was proof, they believed, that Malta was meant to survive. But as the smoke of World War II cleared, Historians and ballistic experts began to look closer at the wreckage of that afternoon. They wanted to know the cold, hard physics of why 300 people walked out of that church alive. And that is where the history of this urban space detours in one of the most compelling mysteries of the war. The first and most technically sound explanation comes down to pure geometry. When the bomb fell, it didn't hit a flat roof. It hit Giorgio Gronit's self-supporting dome. Because the stone ceiling was so deeply curved, the bomb struck the outer masonry at a highly acute angle. Ballistic experts suggest that this angled impact caused a massive, violent shearing force. As the bomb punched through the stone, the friction and impact may have physically ripped the delicate mechanical fuse right off the side of the casing before the firing pin could strike the detonator. The very architecture that made the church a target is what destroyed the weapon's ability to explode. But there is another theory, a human theory, and it is one that is echoed through the streets of Mosta for generations. During the war, a rumour began to circulate through the Mediterranean. It was said that when the bomb disposal unit emptied the explosive powder from the casing, they found something very unexpected inside. Instead of TNT, a portion of the payload had been packed with sand. And tucked inside that mechanism, supposedly, was a small, torn scrap of paper. And on that paper, written in a hurried, trembling hand, was a single phrase in Czech, "From Pilsen, with love." The story goes that this bomb had been manufactured in the famous Skoda munitions plant in Pilsen, in what was then Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. The factory was staffed entirely by forced labourers. Czech citizens rounded up by the Gestapo and compelled at gunpoint to build the weapons that would destroy Europe. According to this legend, a group of these factory workers engaged in a silent, incredibly dangerous act of sabotage. Under the noses of their German overseers, they deliberately disabled fuses or replaced the explosive with sand on a handful of bombs, effectively sending duds into Luftwaffe's supply lines. It is a beautiful story. It connects a small farming village in the middle of the Mediterranean to a group of brave, nameless resistance fighters in a dark factory in Central Europe. It suggests that the people of Mosta weren't saved by stone or by luck, but by a hidden thread of human solidarity stretching across a fractured continent. But did that actually happen? If you dive into the official military archives of the Royal Engineers on the Maltese National Archives, there is no record of a sand-filled bomb casing or a hidden Czech note from April 9th. Ballistic records from the raid suggest the bomb was a standard SC-500, fully loaded with high explosive that simply failed to detonate due to fuse failure. Yet, in urban history, a myth can be just as real and just as powerful as fact. Whether the note existed or not, the belief in the Skoda factory sabotage served a vital purpose. It gave a traumatised city a narrative of resistance. It meant they weren't just helpless targets waiting to be wiped out. It meant that somewhere, out in the dark, the world was fighting back with them. Today, if you visit the town of Mosta, the urban environment still carries the memory of that Thursday afternoon. The street markets still thrive in the shadow of the colossal limestone crown. And if you walk inside the rotunda and pay a visit to the sacristy, you'll find yourself standing in front of a glass case. Inside is an exact replica of the 500-kilo bomb, its dark grey skin looking entirely out of place amongst the gold trim and oil paintings of the church. But the most profound monument isn't the replica. To see the real history of this space, you have to do what the parishioners did in 1942. You have to look up. And if you look closely at the stunning diamond-patterned ceiling of the Great Dome near the apex, you will notice a spot where the pattern doesn't quite align perfectly. The colours are slightly different, the stonework is a bit fresher. It's the patch where the bomb came through. The people of Mosta chose not to erase that scar. They left it there, visible to anyone who walks through the front doors. It stands as a permanent reminder of the afternoon the sky fell inwards, the afternoon an entire community held its breath, and the day a city's grandest monument refused to break. Next time on Forgotten Urban Histories, we head to the sun-drenched waters of the Venetian lagoon. Venice is a city built entirely for the eyes. It is a masterpiece of marbled palaces, winding canals, and glittering historic squares where the past is meticulously polished, packaged, and sold to millions of tourists every single year. It is a city that prides itself on being unforgettable. But if you get into a boat and travel just a few kilometres away from the grand steps of St. Mark's, you encounter a tiny, overgrown island that Venice would very much like to erase from the map: Poveglia. For centuries, this small patch of land served as the city's ultimate biological firewall, a permanent quarantine station where ships suspected of carrying Black Death were sent to wait out the weeks. It was a space where over 100,000 people were quietly left behind by a civilization that chose to look the other way. And then, when the plague finally receded, the city found an entirely new, deeply secret purpose for the island's isolation: constructing an early 20th century asylum whose grand bell tower still stands over the crumbling vine-choked wards today. It is a place strictly closed to the public, legally off-limits, and fiercely protected by local superstition, a place where the soil itself tells a story that the postcards completely omit. I'm Mark Kerrigan. Join me next time as we explore the silent shores of Poveglia on Forgotten Urban Histories.